Welcome to the Nervous System Care and Healing Podcast, where we talk about how to take care of ourselves in mind, in body, in spirit, while we navigate systems that were designed to keep us dysregulated. I'm your host, Liz, a neurodivergent therapist of color, and I'm really glad that you're here. Hey everyone. So today's podcast is specifically for those of you who discovered your neurodivergence later in life. So whether you were recently diagnosed with ADHD or recently realized that you're autistic, and by recently, I mean any time in the last 1 to 10 years. And whether the way you discovered this was through a formal diagnosis, through the mental health system, or maybe you pieced together information that you were seeing online or in books or in the research and came to this realization about yourself. I do want to say that all experiences of neurodivergence are valid, whether you are self-diagnosed or self-identified or formally diagnosed. There is no one way that this path looks. And even if you're questioning right now, maybe you don't identify with a specific label like autism or ADHD or giftedness. Even if you're just questioning and wondering, that is okay too. You might find bits and pieces of this episode helpful as well. There are a lot of reasons why people more and more these days are discovering their neurodivergence later in life, as opposed to already knowing this about themselves from early on in their childhood. People in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s are discovering that they're neurodivergent. There's also the case where people discover one aspect of their neurodivergence early on, like maybe receiving an ADHD diagnosis in childhood, and then later as an adult realizing that they're also autistic. So more layers of their neurodivergence may become revealed as time goes on. Now, the reason this happens is because, well, as the years have passed, more information has become available in society. If we go back just 10 or 20 or 30 years, the research on autism, ADHD, neurodiversity in general, and how it might present in people of diverse backgrounds, a variety of walks of life, that info was not super available because it wasn't being researched. It still isn't super available, and there is a long ways to go before the research represents the true diversity of the population. For example, if we focus on autism, mainstream depictions of autism tend to center on the experiences of white males and often those of higher socioeconomic status. And then this leads to this assumption in society that autism looks a certain way, when in reality, autism is a multifaceted experience. It is not monolithic. So it does show up across all communities, all genders, races, cultures, and identities. It's just the research and mainstream depictions haven't caught up to that yet. There was actually this 2021 study that found that, quote, although the prevalence of autism has been found not to differ across racial and ethnic groups, studies have found that white children and those of higher socioeconomic status are more likely to be both identified and diagnosed with autism earlier, compared with Black, Latinx, and Asian children, as well as children from low-income families. So in terms of the autistic experience, there is this gap between the people who are getting diagnosed and recognized as autistic versus how many people are actually autistic. And we see this discrepancy with other types of neurodiversity as well, like ADHD. Another reason why people discover their neurodivergence later in life is because as you go through the different phases and seasons of life, your relationship to yourself is changing. So maybe you go through a transition, like you go back to school to get a degree, or you change jobs, or you move homes. So now you're living with a partner instead of living alone, or vice versa. You're living alone for the first time after having roommates your whole life. And then you start to find out things about yourself and your nervous system, how your brain works, what your needs are in daily life. Other transitions that can shake things up would be becoming a parent, navigating perimenopause, or going through a grieving period. Any kind of life change can shake things up enough that then some of your innate neurodivergent traits start to rise to the surface, become more visible or apparent, or start to take up more space in your life than before. So these traits might become unmasked or unearthed. For example, in a period of grief, some people have way less energy to mask. They have way less energy for everything. So the mask drops and more of their authentic self starts to come out in that grieving process. Another example is that in periods of high stress, like going to school, attending classes, working at a high pressure job, some people find it gets harder to rely on the same coping skills that they had been using before. And the skills that had worked before suddenly don't work as well anymore as the stress level in their life rises. So then as those coping skills become less effective than before, then some signs of perhaps autistic burnout or ADHD burnout start to surface. Other traits start to surface, and people realize that they're neurodivergent, and that's why everything has felt extra hard for them compared to maybe their non-neurodivergent peers. And then there's also the example where people discover they're neurodivergent because first their child gets diagnosed with autism or ADHD. And then that leads the parent to realize that, well, they're also autistic or ADHD or both, that this trait can show up cross generationally within the family system. So basically, there are lots of different ways that people come to this understanding of themselves, and there are lots of reasons why this discovery can be a bit delayed. But once you do know this about yourself, things start to change. There is this before and after point. It can be disorienting to discover that there's this facet of your identity or your brain that you didn't know about before, but that's been here your whole life. That can definitely be a lot to process. It can also be relieving for some folks to finally have some language to understand yourself, to finally be able to say, oh, that's why, or oh, there is a word for what I'm experiencing. And of course, it can be very overwhelming because now there is this other box to unpack about yourself. And these next three questions that I'm going to share, I'm sharing them with the intention of stoking curiosity and compassion for yourself wherever you are in this journey. And the first question is, what makes sense now about yourself, about your life, that did not make sense before? So now that you have this language of, oh, I'm autistic, or I'm ADHD, or I'm ADHD, neurodivergent, my brain works differently, things start to make sense and dots start to connect in a different way. So maybe before, in the before times, it seemed like everyone else around you was following some manual, and you're the only one who did not get that manual. And then you're wondering, what did I do wrong? Is this my fault? Why am I so behind? Or why does everything seem harder for me? And then post-diagnosis or post-discovery, that's when you realize that you're running a different operating system than everyone else. The software of your nervous system is different than other people's. And so the manual that everyone else was using might not actually work for you. So then even though everyone else is saying, just try this, just click that button, It's supposed to do that. And then you're like, I don't see the button. I don't know what you're talking about. It doesn't work the same way for me. Now, maybe it makes more sense why there is such a difference between your experiences and those experiences of people around you. And I know it doesn't necessarily feel good to know that things are harder for you because you're neurodivergent, because your brain is wired differently and operating in an environment that wasn't built for your brain. That doesn't feel great to know that. And it can actually be emotionally activating to look around and realize just all of the barriers to entry and the inaccessibility and the ableism and systems of oppression around us. That does not feel great. And that's why one part of processing our experiences also means acknowledging any grief that we might feel around not being seen or heard or not being safe. Grieving might be a part of your process. I've also noticed that as people get acclimated to the vocabulary of the neurodivergent community, so terms like masking or unmasking, rejection sensitivity, demand avoidance, also known as drive for autonomy, meltdowns, shutdowns, burnout. Just having a word for what you're experiencing can feel helpful and validating. Just to know that you are not alone in this experience, that others have navigated this, others struggle with this as well. It doesn't solve the problem of the struggle, but it can lend to a sense of like community and not being totally alone. Plus, once you have a specific word or label for your experience, then sometimes you can find more specific resources that can actually help you. Because if you've been trying to fix anxiety, for example, but you find out later that what you're struggling with is more specifically referred to as sensory overstimulation, then you can direct your search to more specific resources that are addressing the sensory overstimulation rather than the more vague thing of anxiety that you were trying to address before. Now, the next question to consider is, what is one thing that you appreciate about the way your brain works? The purpose of this question is to help us reframe from constant criticism to a little bit more curiosity and compassion toward ourselves. So some of the traits that you may have, traits like being sensitive, being inquisitive, being someone who notices patterns and systems level thinking, someone who pays attention to the details or asks questions that other people don't think to ask. You may have tried to hide these traits out of necessity because you may have been judged or criticized for them, or you may judge yourself for being different in this way. But I want you to also consider that these might be your gifts. The things that make you different also make you a unique human being who has so much to offer to this world. And I know that in the most pathologizing version of the mental health system, neurodivergent folks are discussed in terms of their symptoms rather than in terms of their traits. To name a few examples, ADHDers are criticized for their hyperactivity or for their inability to focus. And autistic people are often criticized for their social deficits or for their abnormal obsessions or interests. So we get so used to this question of what's wrong with me? How do I fix myself? And we so rarely get to celebrate and acknowledge what we like about ourselves and the gifts and the unique skills that can come with our unique brains and nervous systems. That's why I like to ask this question, what is one thing you appreciate about your brain? Start with one, see how many qualities you can come up with. If we removed all expectations of how you should be, if we removed all stigma, I think that there's so many things that we would realize are actually gifts and assets and also skills that we can share with each other and that complement other people's skills. I think one of the problems with a solely neuronormative or neurotypical approach to society is this singular focus on, like, these traits are valuable, this type of person is a valuable person, and everyone else is a defective, broken version of that. Whereas a more affirming point of view, a more celebratory point of view, acknowledges that we all bring something to the table. There's something that your brain does that my brain doesn't do, and there's something beautiful about that. Now, the third question to consider is, now that you know or suspect that you're neurodivergent, how might this change the way you take care of yourself? Because as you start to understand yourself through this lens of neurodiversity and language like masking and unmasking and nervous system burnout, you might notice that you start to judge yourself less and blame yourself less because you start to see the role that systems play. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So systems of oppression like ableism, like extractive and exploitative capitalism, make it harder for us to take care of ourselves. Like, on a systemic level, it makes everything harder because these systems convey the message that if you are struggling, it is your fault and you just need to try harder and pull yourself up by the bootstraps. That is the message behind capitalism, behind ableist structures that place the blame on the individual. And because of the way our systems are set up, because of how unsupportive so many of our environments are, this can cause people to feel guilty for taking care of themselves. It can make people feel guilty for requesting an accommodation or for asking for what they need. So once you know or suspect that you're neurodivergent or highly sensitive, I hope that you let that information empower you to take care of yourself in the way that you need. And this could look so many different ways. It could look like taking that day or multiple days off of work when you're not feeling well, instead of forcing yourself to power through. And then when you do take that time off, remembering that you don't have to over apologize to your boss or your teammates for taking time for yourself. You get to take care of yourself. Another way this could look is not subjecting yourself to situations that consistently drain you. If you know that socializing with a certain group of people or pushing yourself to go to Sunday brunch or whatever, if you know that that doesn't actually work for you and you're masking the whole time and you always leave feeling totally drained, this is your permission to say, okay, I tried that. That didn't work for me. I don't need to keep doing that. I'm going to opt out. Another way that people change sometimes as they embrace who they are, honor their needs, is they stop telling themselves that they're being too sensitive. They stop telling themselves, I'm being too much. I'm too fussy. Like, I'm too high maintenance, especially if you need something around sensory needs. For example, as I learned what types of textures I like to feel on my skin, and as I learned what doesn't feel good on my body, I started to make more mindful decisions about the type of clothing I wear or the bedding and pillows that I use. I started to be more discerning about what kind of smells were around me, all those kind of sensory adjustments. And I share this to say that it is totally okay to acknowledge that you have needs and preferences as well, and that you want to take care of yourself in this way. My final note here is that discovery of your neurodivergence can and probably will intersect with other identities that you hold, like gender identity or sexual orientation or culture, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, ability, or disability. And so this isn't a one-dimensional conversation. This is a multi-dimensional experience. And I've spoken to one layer of it today, the neurodiversity layer. For myself, as a Chinese American second generation immigrant who's also a woman of color who is neurodivergent, there are facets of my identity that have shifted or deepened or reorganized as I came into understanding my neurodivergence and how it impacts me. So I'm putting that out there because we are all intersectional. We all hold multitudes of identity in who we are. And so you might have experiences of other aspects of your sense of self shifting as well. I'll leave you with these 3 questions to reflect on and to journal on, if that is your thing. Number 1, now that you know that you're neurodivergent, what makes sense about yourself, about your life, that did not make sense before? Number 2, what is one thing that you appreciate about the way your brain works? And number 3, how might this change the way that you take care of yourself? All right, that's it for now, and I will talk to y'all again next week. Thank you so much for listening to the Nervous System Care and Healing podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow or subscribe on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. And if you ever have a few minutes to leave a rating and review, it would mean so much to me, and it helps other people to find the podcast and spread the care. Please remember that this podcast is not a replacement for therapy, coaching, or professional mental health services. The information shared here is generalized, it may not reflect every individual nuance, and it should not be interpreted as personalized mental health advice. So please do seek out additional support if you need it. Take care and be well. This is Liz at Nervous System Care and Healing.